Now is my second video. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. So I'm a student here at Gallaudet University, and I'm in the field of education. And today I wanted to talk about learner autonomy. You're probably wondering why I chose that sign. It's pretty fascinating, right? Well, in the year 1901, there was an idea that students can be in control of their background and their education and their field. So, like I was saying, why did I choose that sign? Well, I was teaching high school, and there's many students that were struggling with understanding that. And so I would see these students struggling, and they would always tell me, "Leave me alone." And what I would say was, "Wow, they would use this sign of being alone," and I thought that was a very powerful sign to use. So think about that perspective on being alone, and in school and education, and being a student in deaf residential schools and then in mainstream schools. It's a fascinating idea. So for my life, this is the sign that I've used throughout my life, and the sign that I've used throughout my studies. So I grew up in a mainstream program. When I went into school, I remember taking a math course, and people were looking at me, and I remember one time that I was told to leave the class, and I was in a high-level math, and that was in 1994. And they told me that I couldn't be in other classes also. In theater, in sports, I wasn't able to participate. When I was in 12, luckily, I was able to leave the mainstream program, and I was able to apply for another program. So when people offered to help me, I thought, no, I'm okay, I can do this on my own. So now, when I was in school, I remember I joined college, and I had students I had students that had come in from a mainstream program. Students that were deaf and that were hard of hearing. Often students, they like to take control, and they never know why. They're very eager, they're very fascinated about certain topics, and oftentimes they're not always able to take classes that they're always interested in. I want to be able to give my students more opportunities to take classes that they're interested in. So I have 16 students, one deaf student. And the first day of school, I had a student come up to me and often would just sit and just want to chat with me, and it was a deaf student, and they would want to just chat. So, the class itself was seated in rows. It's typical for a mainstream classroom, but I did have students with cochlear implants and who didn't use sign language. And I had a interpreter correction. I had a student ask if they could be moved so they could be able to see the entire class. That way they could see the mouths of other students moving if needed. And I thought, yes, that's fantastic, of course. This student is taking control for themselves, so I let them go ahead and do that. And I continue to teach the class. Well, what happened was I had a audiologist come in the class and commented on how the student was sitting across the room being able to view everybody, and said, absolutely not, this student needs to be moved back. They can't sit there. So I had a talk with the audiologist, and I said, the student can choose to sit where they want if that's where they want to sit, and that's where it's going to most benefit them, sitting in this part of the classroom. It's important to have the student comfortable in any environment, and that they're able to accommodate to what they need. So I have another story from another student. This student was so bright, deaf student. For years and years actually struggled and entered into school at 8 and then left at 21. So, I asked the student, why are you struggling with reading? And the student enjoyed having a discussion with me. And, finally, I was able to tell the student, you need to go into another classroom, go check out the library. And, the student said to me, where can I find a book about Black deafness? I've never seen a book that was about being Black and being deaf. It really made me realize that this student had felt alone in this class. There was so much that was very abstract for me to understand, because I had brought history books, and you see deaf history books, but do these students ever read Black deaf history books? So I tried to gather a few different materials, and really it was hard to find these books that related to the student's experience. Understand that students will improve, and if they feel connected to the material that they're reading, they'll come up to me and they'll ask me questions. But most of the time, students are never motivated to read. They're never eager to read the material. It's not always about deaf children being able to see something visual and being able to read. There's a lot of factors that play into their identity. Socioeconomic status is also a big factor as well. For example, there's students that have personal problems, and sometimes they're not aware that they have access to advisement. And sometimes I have to go and ask which books are available for students to be able to read. And then there's staff that evaluates their behavior, the student's behavior. But as I'm sure some of you know, that some deaf students have a reading level that is lower than the average reading level of their hearing classmates. This is really conflicted for me because it's a huge problem. The problem is with the system. You have to look at different perspectives. Just last week, for example, I was in a high school class. There was a student that was reading at a 5th grade reading level. How is that appropriate? It's not appropriate because a hearing student wouldn't be at that level, right? So how is a deaf student supposed to be better than a hearing student? It's impossible because the deaf student is struggling. The hearing person already knows what they need to know. So the learner autonomy is really for students to be able to take control of their education. I could go on forever about this topic. Really, I could. But it's often talked about how it's attracting other students, but from this experience, and you can imagine how students will just flourish if you teach them about other students' experiences and explain how the society is set up and how people interact in different groups. So we've already discussed that this student was reading at a fourth grade reading level. That has impacted me. So how do students learn how to control themselves, move from having the students be dependent to being able to read on their own? There are so many researches that show that students can think about their own and take control of their own learning, and then they will flourish and they will grow. So autonomy. This is an important topic. And 100% of deaf students in 2013, there's actually a published reading that talked about this in college. And you saw that how students entered into college, they weren't asking questions. And the deaf students were just sitting there, just being taught at. There was no progression in their education. They would sit there and absorb the information, and that's not what you do at a college level. So, deaf people all over the United States, they share the common experience of autonomy. And I'd like to redirect this in a different direction. Everyone has their stories about growing up in a mainstream program, and I won't have enough time to go over every single question. But there's not enough writings about deaf people in public schools, and it's incredible, actually, that these deaf students share the same experience all over. And you want to know what happened to me when I was 8? A friend in Texas, she actually shared this story with me, that she became hearing. She was deaf, and she didn't meet another deaf person until she was 12. It's clear for the future how we can set up goals for each student. Once we set up a school, we set up staff, and we can have the children in the school. So the girl that I just shared about from Texas, she actually passed away. She became hearing, and she had the experience of autonomy. Also, there's a certain aspect of economics that plays into this. So New York had a big protest just recently because the school didn't have enough money. And there were children all over that were fighting just to help this cause. So if we want to see changes, we have to learn, and we have to stay positive and look towards the future. And when these problems pop up, we have to be willing to tackle them. But I really, again, want to put emphasis on that idea of autonomy and how we need to change the system and fix the gap, fill the gap, interpreter correction. So remember I talked about the deaf student in my class that was starting to read by himself? We have to support those students. We have to support deaf students being interested in deaf literature so that they don't feel alone. It's also important to change school options. So parents typically visit different school programs, right? They see an advisor and check out the education. But it's important that we play a role in this and that we need to explain the benefits of a signed language and that we can be that role model for their deaf child and encourage deaf students to attend deaf residential schools. We also would have to recruit deaf staff. There are often not enough deaf students that have access to communication all around them in their environment. We can't just expect to leave students and expect them to do it on their own. No, there's so many layers that are involved. And there's deaf counselors. And sure, that process can be rough, like that girl I just said. She was able to set up her counseling appointment, and she had to be willing to communicate and learn. So I want to go back to this idea of students having to take control of their own education. That's the idea here. Thank you very much.